There's a stretch of woods not too far from where I live, where the trees grow so thick you can't see much past 10 feet in any direction. I had hiked the woods before, but never went far. It's all pines packed together like they're trying to choke out the sun, and the farther you walk into them, the darker it gets. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a way to clear my head. I had had a shitty week. Work was kicking my ass, and my girlfriend had just left me. She said I was distant, disconnected. I couldn't argue with her. I felt off for months. It was like everything was just a little out of sync. Like I was living a half second behind everyone else. So I drove out to the woods, hoping the quiet might help. It was late afternoon when I started walking. The sun was still up, but by the time I hit the tree line, the pines swallowed it up. The air got cooler, the shadows longer, and every step felt like it took me further from the world I knew. But that's what I wanted. A little space. A little distance. I walked for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper, until I started to wonder whether I could find my way back. That's when I saw it. The cabin. It was barely visible through the pines, just a dark shape nestled between the trunks, like it had been there forever, forgotten by the world. I walked past the trees to the clearing where the cabin was. The wood was gray with age. The roof shingles and one of the windows were shattered. It didn't look welcoming, but something about it drew me in. I stepped out of the trees and into the overgrown path leading to the cabin's front door. I should have turned around. I don't know why I didn't. I just wanted to look inside. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust. There was hardly any light except for the dim glow filtering through the trees outside. The floor was covered in dirt and debris, broken glass, leaves, something that might have been bones, though I didn't look too closely. I wasn't alone. At first I thought it was just the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the small space, but then I heard it again. First a shuffle, then a breath, and then a voice. "Welcome, stranger." I froze. The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it came from deeper inside the cabin, from the shadows. My heart hammered in my chest. I'm sorry," I stammered, and I turned to leave, but the door had swung shut behind me, trapping me in the dark. The voice came again, clearer this time. "You've come far, but this is where you stay." I couldn't see anyone, but I felt something, a presence. It wasn't friendly. My legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor, and the air around me seemed to thicken. My head swam, and suddenly, I wasn't sure where I was. The cabin felt wrong. Like it wasn't just a building, but something alive, something watching. I took a step back, my foot crunching on the debris beneath me, and that's when I noticed it. The cabin was changing. The walls began to shift, move, and change direction. The room almost felt like it was breathing, expanding and contracting in slow, shallow breaths. The windows where there should have been fading light from outside were now pitch black. as if the cabin had disappeared entirely into a void. And the floor beneath my feet, it wasn't dirt and debris anymore. It was stone, cold, damp stone. I don't know how long I stood there, watching the impossible changes. But when I turned around, the front door was gone. In its place was a hallway, a long, narrow corridor stretching out into the dark. The voice came again, closer now. "Keep going." I didn't want to. I didn't have a choice. My feet moved on their own, carrying me down the hall, the walls pressing in on me as I went. The deeper I went, the more everything around me twisted. The floor sloped at impossible angles. The walls pushed like they were alive, and the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. The voice, God, the voice. It followed me, whispering things I couldn't understand, words that didn't make sense but filled me with dread. By the time I reached the end of the hall, I wasn't even sure if I was still in the cabin. The space around me was wrong, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The walls were lined with symbols, crude, jagged things carved into the wood and stone. Symbols that seemed to shift when I looked away. My head ached, and time wasn't right anymore. I checked my phone, but the screen was blank. No signal, no time, nothing. My watch had stopped, its hands frozen in place. I couldn't tell how long I'd been there. Minutes, hours, days. It didn't matter. There was no escape. At the end of the hallway, there was a door. Old, rotted, hanging on rusty hinges. I didn't want to open it, but the voice, now right beside me, beneath my ear, left me no choice. "Open it." I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. The door swung on its own, revealing a room. The room was white beyond white. White walls, white floor, a bright white light, and single metal chair. And sitting in the chair was me. I don't know how to explain it. It was me, but old, gaunt, pale, like I hadn't seen sunlight in years. My eyes were sunken, my skin stretched tight over my bones. The other me looked up, meeting my gaze, and smiled. "Finally." I said. It was the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. "Sit," the voice said. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was coming from the other me. I backed away, but the door slammed shut behind me. There was nowhere to go. The other me stood, moving with a slow, deliberate grace, and stepped toward me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The other me reached out, his hand cold and clammy, and touched my shoulder. The moment he did, everything changed. I was in the chair now, looking at the door, the same door I had just come through. I could feel the presence all around me, the same cold, malevolent force that had followed me from the moment I entered the cabin. I waited for what felt like eternity, stuck in the chair. It felt as if decades passed. I watched my body grow old, gaunt and pale, and then the door opened, and someone stepped in. It was me again. This cabin, this place, it traps you, it twists you, breaks you, and then it makes you part of it. A loop, an endless cycle of fear and confusion, of watching yourself walk through the door over and over again, knowing what was coming but powerless to stop it. The voice spoke one last time as I watched myself approach the chair. Welcome home. I feel like I was in the loop for centuries. Time doesn't work the same in the cabin. It's endless. Every moment stretches out like an eternity, and yet it all blurs together. I've lost track of how many times I've watched myself walk through that door and sit in this chair, growing old until I walk through the door again. Every time myself approaches the chair, I'm then in the chair again, but younger again. But I begin to feel a change. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the air, the presence, though it never spoke to me again. Didn't feel like it was watching me anymore, almost as if it was distracted. I could feel it shifting its focus elsewhere. I didn't understand why until the door creaked open. It wasn't me this time. It was someone else, someone new, someone fresh. He was younger than me, maybe in his early 20s, with shaggy hair and a confused expression on his face. He looked around the room like I had when I first came here, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. And when he saw me sitting in the chair, I wanted to warn him. I wanted to tell him to turn back, to run, but the words wouldn't come. I could only watch as he moved closer. Then for the first time, I felt like I had control over my body again. I stood up, facing the man. I knew what I was supposed to do. I placed my hand on his shoulder, like the older me had done the first time I entered. Though, was it the first time? Through tired breath, I forced out the words. It's your turn. The man was then in the chair, and for the first time in what felt like centuries, I crossed the threshold back out into the hallway to leave the cabin. I turned one last time to the room, to the man. I looked at terror in his eyes, his body now paralyzed in the chair. I'm sorry, I said to him before turning. Leaving the cabin, I no longer felt as if the presence was watching me. I knew it was done with me, its focus now on the new prize. The moment I stepped out of the cabin, the air changed. The oppressive weight lifted completely, and the suffocating darkness that had surrounded me for so long was gone. I was back in the woods, standing under a sky that was now a brilliant, blinding blue. I fell to my knees, gasping for air. The pines swayed gently in the breeze, birds chirping overhead, and the world felt real again. But it should have been different. After everything I endured, surely the world outside had changed. Surely centuries had passed. With shaking legs, I made my way out of the pines. My car was still parked at the edge of the woods, right where I left it. The trees looked the same, the path untouched. Even the air smelled the same. crisp and cool, like it had that first afternoon when I walked into the forest. I pulled out my phone. The screen flickered to life, displaying the date and time. It had only been a few hours. I looked at myself in the camera, and I looked fine. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, staring at the device in disbelief. Somehow, despite everything I'd been through, despite the endless time I'd felt trapped in that hellish loop, almost no time had passed at all. The world hadn't changed, but I had. I drove home in a daze, the events of the cabin swirling in my mind. When I pulled into my driveway, everything was the same. The neighbors' cars were parked where they always were. The street was quiet, familiar. But I know what happened. I know that place, whatever it is, exists. And somehow, impossibly, I've been given another chance. But I know one thing. I will never step foot back in those woods. I know if I do, I might not be lucky enough to get out a second time. And if you ever find yourself walking through the pines and you see a cabin, run.